In the still woods of Seattle, where fallen leaves whisper like memory, a man plays the flute. But the sound doesn't just echo, it calls the wind back. And from that hush, a pale gray horse appears. Hoofless, voiceless, only watching. Then a boy steps forward, handing him a necklace with a hoof-shaped stone, whispering, "The horse asked me to give you this." From that moment, the music is no longer for the living. It's a summons for what has never been forgiven. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and join us on more cinematic storytelling journeys unlike anything you've seen before. Seattle, not the postcard skyline, not the Pike Place shimmers. This is the quiet edge. The tree line presses against a ribbon of mist, and just beyond the forgotten end of a gravel road, curls like a question mark in the pines. That's where Benjamin lives. The screen fades in slow hushed. A low wind murmurs not through digital soundscape, but real authentic rustling through cedar and Douglas fir, bending dry branches in invisible rhythm. The morning is still waking up, and the light is gray, dappled. Inside a shack, a cabin built of patchwork wood and leftover tin, a figure sits by an open window. His back is to us. He's motionless save for his fingers curled around a long, dark wooden flute, a Native American-style drone flute worn carved with time and something else. Sorrow, maybe. Benjamin, 40s, lean, weathered like he's been dried by the wind over years and hollowed out from the inside. He's not playing for anyone, not even for himself. The breath he sends through the flute isn't a performance, it's a ritual, maybe a plea. The notes that emerge are slow, deliberate. They drift upward like smoke, but heavier somehow, like they carry weight or memory. Then the wind shifts. It doesn't blow across the cabin as it should. It pulls backward against the direction of the trees, against the smoke from the morning fire. Against logic, as if the music calls it. As Benjamin plays, the camera pivots. It follows a fallen yellow maple leaf as it lifts spirals, then joins another, then more. They circle caught in some silent vortex until unmistakably they form a figure 8 in the air and dissolve. Cut to black, a soft breath, then a slow dissolve back in. Interior. The same cabin, now quiet. Benjamin is asleep on a cot pushed against the wall, still holding the flute as if it anchored him in sleep. On the floor by his side, a small faded photograph curled at the corners. We move in slowly. The image is almost lost, but we can make out a horse, gray, mid-gallop, blurred, and a boy, barefoot clinging to its mane, barely more than a shadow. He murmurs something in his sleep. We don't hear it. We don't need to. The look on his face, eyes twitching beneath lids, mouth slightly parted, tells us the dream is not peace. It's memory or guilt. Outside, the wind hushes like a breath held in. Next scene. Benjamin awake. He walks outside barefoot, wrapped in a tattered wool coat. There's a solemnity in his movement, not dramatic, but resigned. The earth is damp. Every step makes a sound. He stands by a low wooden railing and looks out toward the forest. The trees there are dense shadowed, and they hum. He lifts the flute again. This time he hesitates. His fingers hover just above the holes, like they're remembering a language they once spoke fluently long ago. He plays. The wind shifts again, that impossible reversal. This time more insistent, more intentional. And for a moment the world forgets itself. Cut to wide. The forest floor stirs. Leaves rise not in chaos, but in choreography. The figure 8 again sharper, now tighter, more exact. The sound of the flute pierces through the hush, joined by an echo almost imperceptible, not human. A whinny, faint, distant, but there. Benjamin stops. His eyes flicker not wide with wonder, but with dread. He's heard it before. Fade. Cut to interior later. The photograph has moved. It's now perched on a table beside an open notebook filled with scratched-out music notes, lyrics, pieces of something unfinished. The page on top bears a title, Ride of the Hollow Horse. A line beneath it scrawled hastily, "For those who were ridden before they could run." A knock at the door. Benjamin doesn't move. The knock comes again, gentle, persistent. Finally he opens it. Harper, 50s grounded. A presence that doesn't ask to be welcomed, it simply stands and waits. She wears silver earrings shaped like feathers and carries a clipboard under her arm like it belongs there. She doesn't smile. She doesn't need to. "Thought I'd find you here," she says. Benjamin says nothing. Harper walks in without asking. Looks around like she's been there before. Maybe not this cabin, but this kind of place. "You still playing that thing?" she asks, nodding toward the flute. Still nothing. "You know they're doing the Founders' Day Fair down in town. Real crowds this year. They're honoring Chief Sahim's memory finally." Took him long enough. He crosses his arms. She turns, points a finger at him like a mother might, sharp but not unkind. You owe him one. The silence stretches. Harper sighs, sets the clipboard down. They want music, Ben. Not pop. Something real, something with a story. His jaw clenches. He picks up the notebook and tosses it onto the shelf. Not mine to tell, he mutters. Yes, she says, walking closer, it is. If not yours, then whose? He turns away, looking out the window. The wind is still now. Too still. The song's old, she continues. From the boarding school days. You know that. He nods once. Then play it. I did, he says, voice low. And it brought something back. She stops, looks at him, really looks. What? His silence answers for him. Harper's tone softens. They used to sing it, she says. The kids. Before they were taken. My grandmother said they'd whisper the melody to each other through the slats in the floor. A beat, Benjamin whispers almost inaudibly. That's not all it brings. The wind brushes the window. She stares at him, the weight of history between them. Then softly, some things need to be remembered before they disappear. She turns to leave, stops in the doorway. They're waiting, Benjamin. Whether you show up or not, they'll hear something. Let's make it real. The door closes behind her. He stands there, just him and the wind again. The photograph, the flute, the unfinished song. Outside, the trees bend slightly, not forward, backward, against the wind. This opening sequence seeds the supernatural subtly, not with spectacle, but with reverence. It layers cultural memory, psychological wound, and elemental response. It doesn't tell us what Benjamin is hiding from, but it dares us to ask. And it tells us the wind already knows. The wind had gone silent, not just quiet silent like it had been stunned by what it had heard. Benjamin stood at the base of the cedar flute, still clutched in his hand, the last breath of the morning's song, now long gone. The circle of leaves that had once danced in that strange, deliberate figure 8 had collapsed. Dead. Motionless. And he was breathing too loud. His fingers trembled not from cold, but from memory clawing its way back into the room like a smoke no door could keep out. Then without hesitation, he stepped forward, bent down, and began digging. The soil was soft. Damp from weeks of spring rain, giving way to his hands without resistance, as if it too knew this was overdue. He dug deep, wrist deep, deeper than necessary, like he wanted to bury more than the thing he held. When the hole was wide enough, Benjamin dropped the flute in. Not like an offering, more like a sentence. A judgment passed on himself. He didn't say a word, just covered it back over with earth, pressing it down hard with both palms. Once. Twice. Then he sat beside the tree. His breathing leveled. His eyes fell shut, and the memory opened. The screen washes white, then fades into pale sepia. A boy, maybe 8, barefoot, scratched up shins, standing in the middle of a gravel driveway that carves through waist-high grass. A storm looms somewhere beyond the trees. He clutches a stick in one hand, not a toy, not a branch, something he's whittled, something meant to be a flute. Primitive split at one end. He raises it to his mouth, blows. It shrieks more than it sings, but he grins like it's gold. Behind him, the house. Not a home, a carcass of what once might have been. Shingles missing, door hanging off its hinges. The sound of shouting filters through the air. A man's voice, slurred, hoarse. Benny, you little sheety, get your ass back here. The boy doesn't flinch. He bolts, runs through the tall grass, holding the flute to his lips, huffing out breathy, broken notes as he moves. His feet slap the dirt. He leaps over roots, ducks under branches, and then we see it. From his eyes, the clearing ahead. And something more, a shape, a horse, not real. But in the boy's mind, it is solid. Gray. Massive. With a mane that whips back in the wind. A hollow glow behind its eyes. It appears from nowhere, but it waits for him. The boy doesn't hesitate. He climbs on. There is no saddle, no reins. But there is connection. A wild, silent contract. They ride. Through brush, through shadow, through a storm that hasn't broken yet but threatens to. The boy's hair is plastered to his forehead. His breath comes in gasps. But he keeps playing off-key and off-tempo, the flute now screaming like some desperate bird. Behind him in the distance, the father's voice fades. But so does something else. Another voice. Small, high, soft. Ben, wait! He doesn't hear it. He doesn't look back. Cut to black. A door creaks open. Present day. Benjamin's cabin. Late afternoon. Shadows lengthening. He steps inside. Walks directly to a drawer. Pulls it open and pulls out an old photo. Same one, the blurred image of a horse. Only now tucked behind it, a second photo. A girl. 6, maybe 7. Missing teeth in her smile. Sitting in the crook of a tree. Holding a paper flute she's drawn on with crayon. His sister. He stares at it for a long time. Then he places it face down on the table. Outside, a figure watches from a distance. Unmoving, Lean, hoodie up, jeans ripped, shoes soaked. Micah, he's maybe 16, hard to tell. His skin is dark from sun or dirt or both. Hair matted under the hood. He's been watching Benjamin for days. Not stalking, not hiding, just present. Sitting on the same log across the road every afternoon when the wind picks up, waiting. When Benjamin steps out again without the flute, this time Micah calls, only barely loud enough to reach him. Where's the sound? Benjamin squints. You broke it, Micah asks. Benjamin doesn't answer, just walks toward the woods, ignoring the boy like he's missed. Micah hops off the log. I liked it, he says. What you played? No response. I heard something else in it, Micah adds. Not just music. Benjamin turns. Something in his face shifts, not interest. Alarm. What do you mean? Micah shrugs. It wasn't notes. Not really. There was something under it. He makes a gesture with his hands, circling the air near his ears, like a sound trying to get out of your song. Benjamin studies him. Something stirs. Did it sound like anything, he asks slowly. Micah cocks his head. Then he grins, crooked and crooked-toothed. It sounded like a horse, he says, but not a normal one. Benjamin's knees almost give. The boy steps closer. You hear it too, don't you? Benjamin's voice cracks. How long you been sleeping out here? Micah shrugs. Month, maybe 2. Parents. The boy shakes his head. Just the city. Didn't like it. Benjamin nods. That makes 2 of us. He turns to leave, but Micah adds one last thing. She died, didn't she? Benjamin freezes. Micah continues, tone gentler now. The little girl. The one you left behind. Benjamin turns around. His face has gone pale. How do you know that? I don't, Micah replies. You wear it. Like a backpack you never take off. They stand in silence. The forest leans closer like it's listening. I never meant to leave her, Benjamin says finally. I thought I'd come back. Just needed a moment to breathe. And the horse? Benjamin looks up. It wasn't real. Micah just nods. Mine wasn't either, he says. But it still shows up. Benjamin frowns. You too. Micah's eyes darken just for a moment. Yeah, he says. Sometimes it finds people like us. Kids who run. Adults who never stopped. Another silence. This one warmer. Benjamin gestures toward the porch. You hungry? Micah smiles. Always. Inside, the kettle boils. The cabin fills with the scent of chamomile. Benjamin ladles soup into a chipped bowl. Places it in front of Micah, who eats like it's his first real meal in weeks. You gonna dig it back up? Benjamin stares. The flute, Micah says. You can't bury something that doesn't belong to just you. Benjamin leans back. What makes you think it doesn't? Micah wipes his mouth with a sleeve. 'Cause I heard it too. Outside, the wind picks up again. Not strong, not dramatic, but backward, against the trees, against the way it should. And somewhere far faint underneath the wind, the softest echo, a whinny, like a memory that refuses to stay buried. There were only 2 reasons Benjamin agreed. 1, Harper wouldn't stop asking. 2, the wind had gone quiet, and that frightened him more than anything else. So when the truck pulled up on the edge of the grassy square just past the old cannery lot, when the makeshift wooden stage creaked under the weight of old speakers and borrowed microphones, and when someone handed him a cold thermos of tea, like it might calm the tremor in his fingers, he didn't say no. He just nodded and sat. The field wasn't much, maybe 50 folding chairs in a semicircle, most half-occupied by families eating fry bread or kids in painted faces. Paper lanterns swung from nylon wire. There were booths selling beaded earrings and fry pies, fry everything, really. It looked normal. Too normal. And that made the air feel wrong. Benjamin sat cross-legged on the stage, the flute already resting in his lap. It had been cleaned, oiled, polished, still cracked at the seam but intact, almost like it forgave him. Micah sat behind the last row of chairs on a rusted bike rack. Hood up, elbows on knees, watching, always watching. Harper moved through the crowd with her clipboard and her presence. She clapped twice. Folks, we've got something special tonight. She gestured toward the stage like she was presenting a sacred object or a ghost. Please welcome Benjamin on. No one clapped at first. Not out of rudeness, just confusion. Most didn't know the name, but a few older women in shawls nodded. One man over 60 crossed his arms and mouthed, "About damn time." Benjamin didn't rise. He didn't look at the crowd. He just lifted the flute to his lips. A hush fell slow, unsure, and he began. The first note was low, too low. It rumbled more than sang, a root note, a wound. Then came the second, a rising tone, mournful with just a trace of breath beneath it. Not imperfection, not mistake breath, as texture, as ghost. It was the beginning of Ride of the Hollow Horse. People stopped chewing. Children stopped wriggling. Even the paper lanterns stopped swinging. The melody moved, like a memory being unwrapped. Slow, intentional, and then the wind shifted. One gust sudden, not strong at first, just off, like a whisper from the wrong side of the trees. Benjamin's eyes flickered. He kept playing. Micah sat upright, arms dropping from his knees. His lips parted not from surprise, from recognition. Another gust, then another, then the sky darkened. Not storm cloud dark, but shadowed, like the sun forgot its place. On the fourth note of the second verse, the speakers screeched. Not feedback, not electronics. It sounded like a scream. The crowd startled. One kid began to cry. Harper stood, stepped forward, then froze. Benjamin didn't stop. He closed his eyes, let the wind come. By the seventh note, the wind had teeth. It tore through the tents, ripped a vendor's cloth banner into the sky, flipped over a bucket of dream catchers. Screws tore loose from the speaker stands. A microphone flailed like a wild snake. People screamed, and still Benjamin played. Then, a sound beneath the flute, layered, faint, too low for the crowd, but not for him, not for Micah. A whinny, stretched out, mournful, deep and old, like something calling from another plane. Micah stood eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. But Benjamin was already crying. Not sobbing, weeping. Silent, controlled. As if his body knew this moment would come and had trained for it. The sound built not louder, but wider. Surrounding, and then the leaves began to move. The camera pans, wide. The dirt clearing churns with wind. Dozens of leaves take flight. Red, yellow, brown. They spin not chaotically, precisely. They form a wide, spiraling pattern. The crowd backs away. Some flee, but most stay. Hypnotized. The leaves rotate in a perfect figure eight. Big, intentional. Micah steps into the clearing. Doesn't look scared. Looks seen. The whinny becomes clearer. Not played, not imagined. Present. Benjamin holds the final note longer than he ever has. His fingers locked in position. His body vibrating. The wind rips his coat sideways. His hair is wild. He opens his eyes, and the wind stops. Dead, like the world took a single breath and forgot to exhale. Silence. A child crying. A mother yelling someone's name. Then, the applause starts. But it's unsure. Sparse. Like no one's certain what just happened. Micah doesn't clap. Harper doesn't move. Benjamin sets the flute down. Looks at his own hands like they belong to someone else, and walks off the stage. The sun dips. The booths are half empty. People whisper, then go home. Harper wipes down a folding chair with a wet cloth. Her clipboard is gone. Benjamin stands by a tree, staring into the branches. Micah sits cross-legged in the grass nearby, silent. Then a movement small, quick from the shadows. A boy, maybe 10, dirty face, wide eyes, shirt 3 sizes too big. He walks straight toward Benjamin. No fear, no hesitation. Stops 3 feet away, holds out his hand. In it, a leather cord. At the end, a stone. Smooth, oval, pale gray with a curved notch. A horse's hoof, or what looks like one. The boy says. His voice is high, tired, like he's been walking for days. Benjamin stares. "Who gave you this?" he asks. The boy shrugs, doesn't answer. Just closes Benjamin's fingers around the stone and walks away. No one stops him. No one else sees him. Except Micah, who stands and watches the boy vanish into the trees. And for the first time since he arrived, Micah smiles. Not wide, not joyful. Just enough to show he already knew. Benjamin doesn't speak for the rest of the night. He sleeps with the stone around his neck, and the wind outside dances quietly. For now, the sound wouldn't stop, even though the wind had stilled. Even though the crowd had scattered and dusk had smothered the clearing, the sound kept ringing in Benjamin's ears. Not the melody, not the applause or murmurs or gasps, no. The whinny, low-layered beneath the last note of his flute, fused into it. As if the instrument itself hadn't played a song, but spoken in tongues. He walked home through the woods on autopilot, the leather cord and hoof-shaped stone clutched in his left hand, his right. Gripping the flute so tight his knuckles had gone bloodless. He didn't breathe right. Didn't blink. His footsteps were uneven, sloppy, like his mind was 5 paces behind his body trying to catch up. The boy's voice echoed louder with each step. What the hell does that mean? What kind of horse speaks through children? What kind of man calls one like that? He reached the porch and paused. His hands were shaking. The sky had gone deep navy. The wind, nothing. The air was a vacuum. Too still. Too expectant. As if something just past the edge of the trees was holding its breath. Waiting. Benjamin opened the door with a grunt. Entered. Dropped the flute onto the floor. And screamed. One punch to the wall. Another. He kicked over the chair. Threw the pot from the stove across the cabin. It hit the door, cracked, and fell open. He didn't care. He couldn't stop moving. Couldn't stop hearing it. The hoofbeats. The voice of his father in drunken crescendo. "Benny boy, don't you walk away." His sister's last whisper like glass, "Ben, wait." And beneath it all, the song he had sworn to never play again. He grabbed the flute from the floor, held it in both hands, looked at it like it was alive. like it had grown a mouth and started talking back. Then he raised it and smashed it down against the table. The first crack echoed like a bone snapping. Again, until it split down the middle and the mouthpiece sheared off entirely. He dropped the pieces. They hit the floor with a dead wooden clunk. Then the silence came rushing back in. Heavy, insistent. Benjamin backed up. One step, then another. Then he turned, shoved open the door, and ran. He didn't know where his feet were going, only that they had to go. He tore through the dark, through the wet roots and underbrush, his coat flapping behind him like a broken wing. Branches slapped his arms. Stones slid beneath his shoes. His breath ripped in and out, uneven, shallow, ragged. There was no wind, just the sound of his body hurtling forward uncontained. He stopped only when his legs refused another step, collapsed in a small glade. Knees first, then hands, then full chest on the ground, face buried in the moss. He didn't cry, didn't scream, just breathed hard like something enormous sat on his back. In the faint moonlight, his silhouette trembled. Then, his hands moved, curled upward, positioned themselves in front of his lips, shaped as if holding the flute, and he began to mime it. No sound, just the motion, the fingering, the embouchure, the breath, the pause between verses, the subtle roll of the wrists. As if the instrument had never shattered, as if it was still there. He rocked gently, back and forth, silent music filling the dark like smoke. Sometime past midnight, he found himself on Harper's porch. She opened the door before he could knock. Like she'd known, he looked ruined, hair tangled with dirt, eyelids swollen, scratches across both cheeks. The stone from the boy still in his hand, like an offering that never changed form. He didn't ask to come in. She didn't need to invite him. He stepped inside and collapsed into the nearest chair. "I broke it," he muttered. She didn't ask what. Didn't need to. He looked up at her. Jaw clenched so tight it shook. "I shouldn't have played it." "You had to." "No." He stood. "No, I should have left it buried. I should have let the wind keep it. But He stopped himself, hands opening and closing like something inside was trying to claw its way out. "I thought it was mine. That it belonged to me. That I could control it." His voice cracked. "But it wasn't mine. That song, it belonged to something else." Harper watched him carefully. "You didn't control anything, Benjamin." He turned away. "I called it back," he whispered. "Whatever it was, that sound in the wind, that voice in the song, I called it." He turned toward her, tears finally slipping loose. What if it wasn't just a sound? What if it was them? "A beat?" Who? Harper asked. "My father? My sister?" "Hell, me." His laugh was dry. "All the versions of me I left behind when I ran." "You didn't run," she said quietly. "You survived." "No." He looked up at her. "That's the lie I tell to keep breathing." He crossed the room, grabbed her arm. Not hard, but enough. "I felt it, Harper. Something came through that song, something old. Not dead. Just waiting for me to call it. And I did." She didn't flinch. Instead, she said something that stopped him cold. "You weren't playing for the living, Benjamin." His eyes narrowed. She stepped closer. "You were calling the dead. Every note you played, you weren't speaking to us. You were opening a door for them." He let go, stepped back. "You think I summoned ghosts? I think ghosts don't wait for permission. They just need a voice. And you gave them one." He collapsed onto the couch, rubbed his eyes hard. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said. "No," she replied. "But maybe they do." He looked at her. "Then why not let them speak?" He closed his eyes. A long silence, then a whisper. "Because I'm afraid of what they'll say." Outside, the trees shifted slightly. Still no wind, but the sound of leaves brushing each other, soft, dry, intimate, filled the air like the breath of a sleeping beast. Harper lit a candle and placed it on the table. Its flame flickered steady. She poured him tea without asking and placed the mug next to his hand. "You're not cursed, Benjamin." He didn't respond. "You're haunted. There's a difference." He looked at the mug, then her. "Doesn't feel different. Haunted means something still wants to find you. Cursed means nothing ever will." He took the tea, sipped, winced at the heat, but kept drinking. "Why now?" he asked. "Why after all these years?" Harper shrugged. "Maybe your silence ran out. Maybe the wind just got tired of waiting." She reached into the cabinet and pulled out something, an old vinyl sleeve. Worn, torn. She slid it toward him. "Your song," she said. "Or one version of it. From the days when they took our children and made them march to someone else's rhythm." He picked it up, ran his fingers over the name. No artist, just a title. "Ride of the Hollow Horse." He read it aloud. The room went cold. "I heard it once," Harper said. "In a chapel where no one believed God still listened. It was barely music. More like a scream that forgot how to die." He set the sleeve down. "It's not over," he said. "No," she agreed. "Even if I stop playing." It never needed your permission, Benjamin. He set the mug down. I have to know what it wants. She nodded. And what if what it wants is to be forgiven? He looked at his hands, curled his fingers again as if the flute was still there, then answered quietly. Then I need to learn how to listen. Outside in the dark, a single gust passed through the glade. Small, intentional, like the beginning of a breath. The next morning, Benjamin woke to the sound of graphite scratching paper. Not birdsong, not the wind. Just the rhythmic whispering drag of pencil on texture. He sat up slowly, his bones clicking in protest. The cabin was filled with early light, thin and hesitant. A coat had been draped over him, not his, too small. Smelled like wet wool and smoke. Across the room on the floor near the cold fireplace, Micah sat cross-legged, hunched over a stack of paper. His backpack lay open beside him, worn to threads. His hoodie hood was down, his hair stuck up like he'd been electrocuted in his sleep. Benjamin rubbed his face. Micah didn't look up. You snore like you're trying to scare something off, the boy said without lifting his head. You broke in, Micah shrugged. You left the door open? Benjamin started to reply, then stopped. Instead, he stood stretched and walked outside barefoot. The grass was damp with dew, the air still. The trees didn't move. Not a single branch. He looked up. The wind had not returned, but something else had. Leaves, dozens of them, scattered across the yard like autumn had arrived too early. And again they were arranged not by chance, but design. A wide, loose swirl. The familiar shape of the figure 8, just like the one in the clearing, just like the one in the memory. But this one, it didn't end. Where it bent, it blurred. Where it curved, it split. Like something trying to finish a sentence, but choking halfway. Micah stepped up beside him, bare feet squishing into the grass. You played it again last night, didn't you? Benjamin didn't answer. You dream it when you don't play it, Micah said. And when you do, you bring something back. Benjamin didn't ask how he knew. He didn't need to. Micah reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out one of the drawings from earlier. Held it up like a receipt. A sketch in bold black lines. A horse. Neck-arched legs, extended mid-gallop tail, coiled like smoke. But the eyes, there weren't any. Just voids, white and blank, empty but watching. Benjamin stared, said nothing. Micah handed it to him, walked back inside. Over the next few nights, Benjamin played again. Not every night, not in full. But sometimes when the pressure behind his ribs got too tight, when the air around him started to hum, he'd pick up the flute and play a verse, a chorus. One breath's worth of melody, maybe two, never more than that. And every time the wind refused to come. But the leaves moved, always the leaves. A new formation each night, always in the same shape, the figure 8 distorted. Interrupted. Incomplete. A circle that wouldn't close. A memory caught in rewind. Micah stayed. He never asked. Just rolled out a sleeping bag near the stove, drew until dawn, and handed Benjamin a new sketch every morning without saying a word. Each one more intricate than the last. Each one the same horse. No eyes. One night, as Benjamin finished drying their bowls, and Micah sharpened his pencil over the porch rail, the silence between them thickened, became something else. Something confessional. Micah broke it. My father hit my mother. Benjamin paused. Micah kept sharpening. Did it when he drank? Did it when he didn't? I stopped counting which was worse. The shavings spiraled onto the floorboards. Benjamin placed the dish towel down, careful not to wrinkle it. First time I saw it, I was 6. He knocked her down over some burnt eggs. She hit her head on the stove corner. Micah didn't look up. I thought she died. He swallowed hard. She didn't, but I think part of me did. Benjamin leaned against the doorway. We left a week later, went to her sister's. But he followed. Said he just wanted to talk. A pause. It was raining that day. One of those horizontal rains. Trees bending so hard I thought they'd snap. Micah's voice cracked. He stood in the yard yelling, begging, crying. I hid under the sink. He tapped the pencil on the rail once, twice. Then the wind came. Benjamin's spine straightened. It wasn't normal. It wasn't angry. It was hungry. It pulled him backwards, like someone grabbed him by the chest. He closed his eyes, and then he was gone. Benjamin stepped forward. Gone how? Micah shrugged. Just gone, into the trees. Never found. A long silence. Then he looked up. And ever since, when the wind howls, I duck. Benjamin exhaled through his nose. Micah nodded toward the flute on the table. But that night, when you played it, it didn't sound like the wind, I remember. He looked down. It sounded like something trying to come back. Later, Benjamin sat on the steps alone, holding Micah's newest sketch in his lap. The horse again, this time mid-rear. Mane wild, hooves flared. Still no eyes. But behind it, another figure. Small, childlike. Arms outstretched toward the horse like a tether. Below the image in pencil. Some of us were never meant to ride alone. Benjamin traced the phrase with his thumb. He hadn't told Micah about the dream. The one where he left his sister in the doorway while the wind roared and the imaginary horse waited outside. He hadn't told anyone. He folded the sketch, placed it into his notebook, then picked up the flute, held it, didn't play, not yet, just pressed it gently against his chest, and waited. The wind didn't come, but the leaves stirred, just slightly, and Benjamin felt for the first time in years like someone was listening, even if that someone had no eyes. The dream didn't begin, it erupted. No warning, no gentle fade in, just the shriek of a horse tearing through Benjamin's skull like the ripping of old fabric, like metal, screaming across wood. He was in a stall, not a barn, not anymore. Whatever it once was had been hollowed out, collapsed in on itself. Rafters, cracked beams, rotted. It felt wrong, familiar and wrong, like memory wearing a mask. The light was gray, not moonlight, not fire. Something sick. The smell was rot, hay blood, and time. And sound, that sound. The whinny deep guttural split down the center. Not pain, not rage. Recognition. He turned, or his dream self did, and there it stood. The horse, tall, muscled, coated in sweat and grime. A wild gray with eyes like sinkholes. But more than that, it was broken. One leg gone, the front left, but it didn't fall, didn't falter. It stood as if the rules of anatomy had never applied. And it screamed again. Benjamin stumbled backward. His foot caught on something soft, unmoving. He looked down. Her, his sister, hair tangled with straw, lips blue, eyes half open, not wide with fear, just open, empty. He dropped to his knees, screamed a name he couldn't form, reached out, but the moment he touched her, her body scattered into ash, and the horse reared. The sound rising, merging with something metallic, something fluted, a melody woven with agony. And Benjamin woke up choking. He shot upright, sheets twisted around his chest, sweat plastering his shirt to his skin. His breath hitched, scraped. He clawed at his own throat before remembering he was alive. He was home. The cabin was still dark. Just the coals in the hearth, pulsing low. But the dream wasn't gone. It clung to him like humidity, heavy and invisible. He swung his feet to the floor, palms shaking. Ran a hand through his hair and touched the back of his neck, wet. He looked around like something might still be in the room. Something four-legged. Then he saw it. The flute, broken. Abandoned on the corner table. The crack splitting its spine like a wound he couldn't stop opening. And next to it, the necklace. The stone shaped like a hoofprint. The one the boy had given him. The one that hummed if he held it too long. He took it in his fingers now, just held it, and whispered, no more silence. Later that morning, Benjamin stepped into the pale sunlight with something clenched between his fingers. An old needle bent at the tip. A long strand of hair, dull blonde and impossibly fine, his sister's, saved from a forgotten brush. And the flute. The repair was slow, meditative, painful. He sat cross-legged on the porch. Threaded the hair through the needle. Sank it carefully through both edges of the broken wood, one puncture at a time, like stitching flesh. Every hole screamed, but he didn't stop. He bound it tight, wrapped the last length 3 times, then tied it off with shaking fingers. When it was done, the flute looked ugly. Crude. Scarred. But whole. He pressed it to his lips. Didn't play, just held it there, let the breath sit just behind his teeth. And then he wept, not loudly. Not like the night his father left, or the day they pulled his sister from the riverbank. But full, surrendered, like a dam breaking on its own schedule. Micah watched from the doorway. Said nothing, just stepped forward and placed something beside him on the step, a new drawing. This time the horse had all 4 legs, but no eyes. Not yet. By midday, Benjamin was on the road, the kind of road that didn't exist on maps. The kind with gravel and memories instead of signs. He stood outside Harper's storage unit, clutching the address she'd scrawled for him that morning. Check the far back, left side. Top crate, she'd said. Inside, dust hung like theater fog. The smell was mildew, forgotten paper, and film emulsion. It took him 20 minutes to find it. A battered 8mm tin. Labeled in faded ink, May 19th, Fairgrounds, Lily plus B, first set. He stared at it for a long time before pulling it out. His fingers trembled as they traced the label. The lid creaked open. The reel was intact. He drove straight to Harper's house reel, wrapped in an old scarf like it might shatter from being looked at too hard. She met him at the door, already holding the projector. Didn't ask questions. Just led him into the back room. They set up in silence. Blank wall. Plug in. Thread the reel. The projector stuttered once, then came to life. The image flickered into place. A field. Bright sun-drenched, overexposed. Children darting between booths. Popcorn in fists. Painted faces. Then, the makeshift stage. 2 kids. A boy, maybe 10. Serious. Focused. A girl, maybe 7. Giggling as she tripped over her own shoes. Benjamin. Lily. The boy raised the flute. The girl clutched a tambourine. The reel had no sound. But Benjamin didn't need it. He heard it, every note, the opening bars of the first song they ever played together. His composition, her laughter between measures, her face lighting up when she missed a beat, then chased it back like it owed her money. In the film, they played through the chaos, Lily hopping in place trying to match her brother's tempo, her tambourine clashing awkwardly against his steady notes. At one point, she looked at the camera, smiled, winked. Benjamin laughed out loud. Harper smiled from the doorway. "You remember this?" He nodded, barely breathing. Then the reel ended, just like that. No fade, just a sudden cut. And Benjamin sat there staring at the blank wall as the projector clicked in its emptiness. After a long moment, Harper stepped forward and turned it off. The silence came back, but this time it didn't hurt. Not like before. Benjamin turned to her, his voice barely a whisper. She never got to play a full set. She always said, "Next time, Ben. I'll get it right next time." Harper sat beside him. "Maybe this is next time," she said. He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him, the oldest part, began to settle. Not heal, not yet. But listen, and he realized something. He wasn't afraid to play anymore. He was afraid to stop. Because the music, however broken, however haunted, was the only thing that kept the silence from burying her memory. And him. And maybe that's what the horse had been trying to tell him all along. The wind was not a curse. It was an echo of something waiting to be named. Benjamin knew something was wrong before he opened his eyes. It wasn't the silence that had become familiar by now. It wasn't the absence of wind or the smell of old cedar drifting through the cabin's cracks. It was the stillness. Stillness that wasn't peace. Stillness that screamed. He pushed back the blanket, stepped off the cot, and looked toward the far corner of the room. The one Micah had claimed for himself the past week, where his backpack sat like a tired animal and the drawings multiplied like moss. But today, nothing. No backpack, no drawings, no boy. Just a single folded sheet on the floor weighed down with a stone. Benjamin's stone. The hoof-shaped pendant. He stared at it for a long time, before reaching down slowly, as if the paper might combust in his fingers. He unfolded it. It wasn't a drawing in Micah's usual style. No heavy black pencil, no chaotic motion lines. This was deliberate, a single image. Benjamin, unmistakable, riding a horse made of wind. Its body curling like smoke hooves, barely formed mane indistinguishable from the air itself. And behind him, a girl, Lily. Not as a child, not as a ghost, but as she would have been. Hair in a braid, eyes open, reaching forward, gripping the hem of Benjamin's coat like she'd always been just a breath behind him, just out of sight. His knees buckled. He sat on the floor. Let the paper rest in his lap like an offering he didn't deserve. He searched for Micah for hours. First the perimeter of the cabin, then the woods, then the trail that led toward town. No footprints, no scraps of food, no cigarette butts, nothing. No one in town had seen a kid like him. Not the gas station clerk who usually sold him instant noodles. Not the old woman who ran the library and let Micah use the Wi-Fi without asking questions. Not even Harper. "He left you that?" she asked, studying the drawing. Benjamin nodded. "I think he knew I wasn't done yet," he whispered. Harper didn't respond, just looked out the window, her eyes narrowed against the distance. Then she said something he didn't expect. "There's a story." He looked up. "Old one. From my grandmother's side. From the river tribes. They called it the Wind Rider. The one who brings the stray back to the circle." Benjamin raised a brow. "Horse spirit?" he asked. Harper nodded. "White. Silent. Shows up only when the soul has wandered too far from its path. Doesn't chase it. Doesn't shame it. Just walks beside it until it remembers the way home." Benjamin blinked. "Micah, maybe he wasn't here to stay," Harper said gently. "Maybe he was here to walk with you. Until you were ready." "Ready for what?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, to forgive the one who forgot how to look back. That night, Benjamin walked further than he ever had. No coat, no flute, only the drawing in his pocket and the stone around his neck. He followed the trails Micah once mentioned. The path past the old ranger station. The place where the pine trees thinned out into aspen and the forest floor grew soft with needles. The moon was heavy above the trees, yellow and full, like it might drop through the canopy at any moment. He passed the spot where the leaves used to form their figure eight. Tonight they were gone. No pattern, no shape, just ground. He kept walking until he saw him, or thought he did. The boy, standing in a clearing, same tattered hoodie, same expressionless face, same eyes that always seemed to see more than they should. "Micah," Benjamin called. The boy didn't move, didn't even blink. Benjamin stepped forward, one hand out. And the boy turned, walked into the trees. Benjamin followed, faster now, heart pounding. He didn't know why fear grief is something else. He didn't care. "Micah, wait, I need to." But when he reached the place where the boy had stood, nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs, no breath in the air. Just silence, the kind that doesn't settle, it stares back. He turned slowly, looked down at the soil. There was a single feather, white, curled slightly at the tip. He picked it up, trembling, and understood. Micah was never here to stay. He was the echo of something Benjamin needed to meet, to hear, to carry. Benjamin returned to the cabin and sat with the drawing for a long time. He looked at Lily's hand, drawn so gently, so purposefully, holding on to him, but not pulling him back. Just holding on. That night, he didn't dream of ash or collapse or the stall with broken rafters. He dreamed of the same clearing, but full of light. A circle of people, old, young, familiar and not, all standing in a ring facing inward. In the center, a single horse. Not wild, not angry, just waiting, eyes closed, as if listening for someone's breath. The next morning, he packed the flute, tied it with cloth, laid it gently in the saddlebag of his old bike. He didn't say goodbye to the cabin. Didn't need to. The wind blew gently as he pedaled into town, finally back at his back. Not pushing, just following. The way home, the forest had never been that quiet. Not even in winter. It was a silence that held weight like a crowd holding its breath. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. A silent audience not made of people, but of time, of ghosts, of everything that had ever been left unsaid. Benjamin stood alone in the clearing. No stage, no microphones, just the towering trees arching above him, like ribs. A single static camera mounted on a tripod, 20 feet away, live streaming. Broadcasting into the nothing, into the world. Harper had helped him set it up. She didn't ask who the concert was for. She only asked, "You sure you want to do this alone?" And Benjamin had said, "I won't be." Now standing there, he wasn't sure if he meant Lily or Micah or the wind. He tightened the strap on the flute case slung across his shoulder. Took one long, full breath, then another. The camera's red light blinked to life. He stepped into frame and sat. The first note came out dry, a whisper. The second fuller, like a throat being cleared after years of silence. By the third, the shape of the song had returned. Ride of the Hollow Horse. A melody carried not by mastery, but memory. A song stitched together from broken days and unburied voices. He played it slower than before. Let the pauses stretch. Let the breath hang in the air like it deserved its own time. He wasn't just playing music. He was carving open a scar. And inside it, everything. The rage. The guilt. The years of not speaking her name. The time he ran. The hand he didn't hold. The door he didn't close. Each note was an answer to a question he had avoided for decades. Each phrase was a hand, reaching backward through the storm, through the dust, through every locked drawer of his mind. The wind did not come at first. It waited, as if needing permission, as if it had been punished once for coming too soon. But by the fourth verse, it arrived. Not with violence, with rhythm. It rolled across the clearing like a slow drum beat, in sync with the tempo, tapping at the leaves, nudging the branches, breathing. Benjamin didn't falter. He let it in. The final section began the climb. The part of the melody that had always scared him. The part Lily used to hum with her eyes closed. The part he'd stopped playing after she died. But tonight he climbed it, note by note, breath by breath, until the final note, one sustained tone, long, unbroken, a farewell. And as it held, the wind surged, not in chaos, in unison. The trees didn't bow. They danced, and beneath him, the forest floor began to stir. Leaves, dozens, hundreds, swirling in silence, at first aimless, then aligned. A circle began to form wide and sweeping, then a second, intersecting, 8, but not just a symbol this time, a path, and in the center shapes, formed not by hand or brush, but by the wind and the leaves and something ancient. A horse, made of fragments, its head bowed, and one leg missing, a broken silhouette, a mirror of the dream, of the guilt, of the memory. Benjamin watched it form. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. The figure remained only seconds, and then with one final gust it scattered. Gone. The wind quieted, but did not leave. It lingered, soft, comforting. Behind him a twig snapped. He turned, and there he was. Micah, standing just beyond the tree line. Hoodie unzipped, face cleaner, eyes softer. He stepped into the clearing like he belonged there. Benjamin didn't speak. Micah walked closer, stopped beside him, looked up, watched the last few leaves tumble back to the earth. Then he said, "Jio Komdang so." Benjamin blinked. His throat tightened. Micah smiled slightly. "It's just everything we tried to shove inside it." Benjamin exhaled shaky, broken reel. Micah sat beside him. Didn't say another word. They just sat, in the clearing, with the wind curling gently around them, not as a warning, but a song finally heard all the way through. He didn't speak. There were no words left that hadn't been tainted by time, or silence, or shame. Benjamin simply stood in the center of the clearing, framed by trees that now felt less like guardians and more like memory keepers. The last breath of his music still hung in the air like steam evaporating slowly into the canopy. In his hand, the necklace, the hoof-shaped stone, the tether to something older than apology. He raised it slowly, not dramatically, not like a priest offering a blessing, but gently, reverently, as if lifting it acknowledged what no language ever could. The forest didn't move. The wind paused again in that strange way. It did not absent, but watchful. His eyes didn't close. They stayed open wide, fixed on a space just above the treetops, like he was waiting for something to appear. Not from the sky, but from within it. And then a shadow cut across the light. A single bird, white-feathered, wide-winged, silent. It sliced through the air just above his head, low and clean, its body tilting slightly on the wind as it passed over the lens of the camera. The red indicator light blinked still live. The bird's wings created a gust that seemed impossibly focused. It didn't ripple the entire clearing. Just one spot. Just the camera. A single push. A breath. The screen shimmered for a second, pixelated, distorted, and then held. Benjamin lowered the pendant, let it rest against his chest, then stepped back, slowly, and turned away. No words. Just a breath. A gesture. A release. The video stayed online longer than he'd expected. Harper had promised she'd delete it after 24 hours. Keep it intimate, she'd said. Sacred. But something else happened. Someone shared it. Then someone else. Then a teacher in Missoula sent it to a colleague in Quebec. Then a girl in Guam posted it with a caption, "I don't know what this is, but it made me cry like I remembered something I forgot." It snowballed from there, not viral in the way of trends or stunts or spectacle, but in the quiet, humming way that grief spreads when it finally finds a name. People didn't comment. They testified. One wrote, "My brother died before I could say sorry. This felt like he heard me." Another, "This is what it sounded like when I watched my grandfather pass." Someone in Finland, "We used to call this the wind horse. I didn't know it was real." Someone in Bolivia, "I saw the same figure when I was 5. I thought it was a dream. I think it was a memory." Benjamin didn't reply to any of them. He didn't have to. The song had done what he couldn't. It had spoken in a dialect everyone carried in their ribs, but forgot how to pronounce. Micah saw the video from the public library. He sat at the back, hoodie draped over his chair, earbuds, and eyes locked on the screen, like it might change if he blinked. He watched it twice, then opened his sketchpad. And for the first time, he didn't draw the horse in fragments or chaos. He didn't omit the eyes. He gave it a face, not human, not animal, not exact, but present. The eyes were not perfect circles or ovals or spheres. They were 2 spirals, each turning inward, not in torment, but understanding. He drew Benjamin in the center of the clearing, flute at his feet, hand on his chest. Behind him the girl, older now, no longer grasping the edge of his coat, standing beside him, unfazed by the wind. Later that week, Harper printed out some of the messages from the video thread and posted them on the wall of the community center, by the piano, by the exit, by the room where they hosted AAA meetings and grief support groups and teenage poetry slams. She didn't highlight the usernames, just the words, no titles, just fragments. "This gave me back my father's voice. I watched this with my eyes closed and felt my grandmother sit beside me. Somehow I think the wind had been waiting for someone to hear it." Benjamin returned to the clearing one final time. No flute, no pendant, no camera. Just himself and the faint smell of pine warmed by sun. The wind picked up as he arrived, a soft one, steady, the kind that brushes the backs of your hands and makes you feel like something is reaching out just to remind you you're real. He stood where the figure 8 had once formed. No leaves, just earth, but that was enough. He crouched down, placed a single rock in the dirt, then a second, then 2 more side by side. It wasn't a circle, it wasn't a horse, just a mark to say something passed here, something healed, something was forgiven. Without a single word. Behind him, birds scattered into the air, but not in fear, in rhythm. The flyer was simple. No colors, no borders, just text. At the top, bold, wind and memory. A community listening circle, healing through sound, silence, and shared breath. Below it, in smaller print, for those who've lived through storms and those who still carry the wind. It was taped to the community center doors, posted on cafe windows, stapled to telephone poles. No one marketed it. No hashtags, no social media page. Just quiet paper and the weight of rumor. And yet the room was full. The first meeting took place in what used to be the senior arts room. Plastic chairs in a circle. A single microphone in the center, not connected to any amplifier, just there as an invitation. Harper stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the way people filed in. Tentative, eyes scanning, looking for something they hadn't admitted they were missing. Some were elders with braided hair and coats that smelled of tobacco. Some were teens with sleeves hiding fresh scars. One woman wore sunglasses indoors and gripped the hand of a boy no older than 10. No one wore name tags. No one needed to. Benjamin arrived late, not dramatically, just deliberately. He waited until everyone was seated, until the hum of uncomfortable small talk had settled into the hush of collective anticipation. He didn't bring his flute, just a thermos of tea and the same look he'd worn in the forest, clearing quiet hollow ready. Harper nodded to him. He took the last seat in the circle. She didn't start with a speech, didn't ask people to share. She just said this. Gió không mang điều gì tới, nó chỉ đưa những gì ta chối bỏ trở về. And for a moment the air in the room shifted. Not temperature, not sound. Energy, like a curtain being pulled back in the mind. A man near the door raised his hand, slowly. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at the microphone, then at the others. Finally, he said, "When I was a boy, I heard a voice on the wind. I told my father. He said it was just the trees. I didn't believe him." A pause. "It sounded like my mother. She'd died 2 years before." Silence. Someone sniffled across the room. The man sat back. Didn't explain further. Didn't need to. Each week more came. Not in droves, not for novelty, but steadily. Because in that room, something happened that rarely did anywhere else. People didn't have to translate their grief into words. They could let the wind speak for them. Harper brought in a small box fan one day connected to a handheld mixer board. She taught participants how to manipulate frequency volume vibration. One woman used it to recreate the sound of her childhood home during typhoon season. A teenage boy looped audio of a violin note and played it backwards. Said it reminded him of how time felt after his sister's overdose. A former firefighter sat in the corner. Every session, eyes closed, fingers tapping the beat of something he never said aloud. Every so often, he'd breathe out sharply, like letting go of a scream he'd swallowed decades earlier. Benjamin, he never spoke. Not once, but he came. Every session, sat in the same chair, listened like it was his job. People began to look for him as they arrived. Not as a leader, not as a performer, as something more important. Witness. One night, Harper brought out a large ceramic bowl filled with river stones. "Pick one," she said, "when you're ready." No explanation, no prompt, just the offer. People took turns. Some kissed their stones before placing them back. Some dropped them in like anchors. One man held his to his ear first, then whispered something so quietly even he may not have heard it. When it was Benjamin's turn, he hesitated, then stood. He took a stone near the bottom of the bowl, small, smooth, white. He looked at it for a long time, then placed it in the center of the floor. Didn't return to his seat. He stayed standing, looking at the circle as if for the first time. Someone asked gently, "Did you hear something in it?" He smiled, small, tired, true. "No," he said, "I didn't." He glanced at Harper. "I think it heard me." By spring, wind and memory had expanded to other towns. A group in British Columbia called it the Circle of Breath. A Navajo artist in New Mexico adapted it into a 3-day retreat under an open tent each day, marked by a new wind direction. A collective of foster youth in Chicago recreated the format, using subway ambiance and heartbeats recorded on phones. One veteran in Maine built wind chimes out of bullets he'd pulled from the walls of abandoned houses in Afghanistan. He called it armor unrattling. Still, Benjamin didn't play the flute, Harper asked him once offhand. They were loading folding chairs into the back of her van. "You ever miss it?" He didn't answer immediately. "Then I don't miss the sound." He paused. "I miss what I thought it would fix." She didn't push. Didn't need to. Instead, she said, "You know, for a long time I thought the wind was punishing me for not protecting my sister." Benjamin looked up. Harper continued, eyes distant. "She died in a fire. The house was old, electrical. But I still think if I'd unplugged that damn radio before I left." Her voice caught. She smiled, bitter and raw. "But then one day I stood outside during a storm and screamed into the gust. Told it to do its worst, and it just carried my voice away." Benjamin said nothing. She turned to him. "That's when I realized yo không mang điều gì tới." He whispered, finishing for her. "Ít chỉ đưa những gì ta chối bỏ trở về." They stood there a moment longer, then finished loading the chairs. As they closed the van, a small whirlwind lifted a paper cup from the ground and spun it twice before dropping it near the tire. Neither of them moved to pick it up. The air was still again, but not in mourning. The silence now carried weight, yes, but a different kind. Like the hush of snow before a child's first footprint, or the pause before a name is spoken softly by someone who finally knows how. Benjamin kneeled in the grass, hammer in hand, sweat beading under his shirt collar. He tapped a nail into the final plank of the wooden horse track he'd spent the last month building. Not a grand racetrack, not a monument, just a ring, a perfect 8, carved from cedar planks, smoothed by hand. 8 wooden horses on wheels, mounted on a gently sloped loop that children could push themselves around by foot. Some of the horses were painted in vivid colors, reds, golds, blues. Others were left bare, the grain of the wood, telling its own story. He stepped back and looked at it, breathed, not pride, something quieter. Permission, maybe. He remembered a drawing Micah had once given him. Of a horse built from clouds, 2 spirals for eyes, a girl riding side saddle behind him. And Benjamin had asked no questions. Now he understood. By noon, families had started arriving. Harper greeted them near the gravel entrance, her clipboard long retired. She wore a windbreaker with stitched feathers along the sleeves, and her hair was braided all the way down her back like the wind wouldn't dare touch it. Kids ran straight to the track, laughed as they chose their horses, each named with a plaque, Whisper, Stormbell, Mirth, Lily. Benjamin had let the neighborhood children help with that part. He stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching, not supervising, not instructing, witnessing. The trees whispered around them, not in gusts, in patience. Then something happened. A boy, maybe 5, shoelaces undone, teeth, gapped from babyhood, climbed onto a bright yellow horse named Echo. His father gave him a soft push, and the boy laughed. Hard, full-chested, head tilted back like nothing had ever gone wrong in his short life. As the wheels turned, the sound of his laughter echoed strangely, not unnatural, but layered. As if the trees caught it and sent it back an octave lower, softer, then louder. Like a note of a flute buried under time, exhaled gently back into the air. Benjamin didn't flinch. He didn't smile either. He just let the moment happen. And that was enough. As the boy came around the final curve, a breeze stirred. Not sudden, not dramatic. It wrapped around the circle like a ribbon, lifted a few leaves from the grass. And for the briefest moment, blink and you'll miss it, the leaves circled in a familiar figure 8 before settling again. Benjamin stepped forward, dropped to one knee beside the track. The boy skidded to a stop in front of him, looked up, panting, grinning wild. Benjamin reached out, not to fix anything, not to teach, just to steady the horse. "Good run," he said. The boy nodded. "Best run." And then, for reasons unknown even to himself, the child leaned forward and whispered, "Did you hear her too?" Benjamin blinked. "What?" "The girl," the boy said. "I think she was riding with me." Then he kicked off again, wheels spinning, laughter trailing. Benjamin stood there a moment longer, then stepped away. The sun began to dip. Families packed up slowly. Kids waved. No one asked who had built the track, but they felt it. The care, the shape, the silence beneath it. Harper approached as Benjamin began loading tools into the back of his truck. She didn't speak right away, just stood beside him, arms crossed. Finally, she said, "You done building?" He looked at her, thought for a moment. "No." "Good," she said, "because people are still coming." He raised an eyebrow. "Somebody called from Anchorage. Said they watched the Windhorse clip. Want to build a track up there. Snow version." He chuckled. "I hope they got better wood." "They said they're using frozen salmon crates." He laughed for real this time. A warm, full sound. Then they both fell quiet again, watching the trees sway, listening to the wind, not for answers, just acknowledgement. The camera fades to dusk. Final frame. The wooden track now empty. Wheels gently spinning in the wind, slow and steady. A single leaf spirals through the center of the figure 8 path. Cut to black. Benjamin's voice off-screen, steady, resolute, cuts through the silence. Maybe I didn't call it at all. Maybe I just finally played the song that pain had been waiting to hear. And it came not to chase me, not to haunt me. It came to bow its head and listen just long enough to forgive. Fade to wind, fade to silence, fade to light.